Welcome to the shadow frequency, where the veil between this world and the next grows thin, and the things that whisper in the dark are given voice. From the cryptic candlelit studios, deep in the Indiana forests, your host, Matt Wilson, and his spectral producer, Juniper Ravenwood, unearth the forbidden, the forgotten, and the fearsome. So, still your heart, dim the light, and listen closely. For once you tune into the shadow frequency, you may never tune out.
Welcome back to the Shadow Frequency. I'm Juniper, and tonight the air feels a little thinner around the edges, like the world itself is holding its breath. We've been away for a few days. We had some things going on, but we're back. You ever notice how the scariest things are not always found in the dark woods or abandoned houses? Sometimes they're sitting quietly in a government archive, stamped, filed, partly released, and waiting for somebody to ask the wrong question. Tonight, I'm pulling out a strange one, episode 347, The Sanitized Apocalypse, Chan Thomas, Pole Shift Panic, and the Adam and Eve Story. This is the story of an engineer and writer named Chan Thomas, a book called The Adam and Eve Story, and a theory that Earth may have been wiped clean before by sudden cataclysms, pole shifts, floods, fires, and civilization resets. But the part that keeps people whispering is the CIA angle. The document exists in government files. It was released in sanitized form, and that leaves one very creepy little question hanging in the air. What was worth sanitizing? Chris, I'll come to you first. What do you make of a fringe apocalypse book ending up with a government stamp on it?
That's the hook right there, June. If it was just an old, strange book, okay, that's one thing. But once the CIA has it in a file, and the released version has that sanitized feel to it, your imagination immediately starts walking down a very dark hallway.
Exactly. It's not just the theory, it's the folder around the theory. That official little frame makes the whole thing feel colder. Matt, how about you? This one has ancient myths, lost civilizations, pole shift panic, and missing pages. What stands out to you?
For me, it's the idea that familiar stories like Noah's flood, Adam and Eve, Atlantis, and ancient catastrophe myths might be treated as memories of something real, not just stories, but echoes. And once you start thinking that way, every myth starts to feel like a warning we forgot how to read.
That's the part that gets under the skin. Maybe the past wasn't just remembered, maybe it was buried. And with that, Matt, the record is yours.
You are tuned to the shadow frequency, where every whisper tells a story from beyond the veil. Hosted by Matt Wilson. Produced by Juniper Ravenwood. With Chris Beach. The darkness continues.
Thanks, Juniper, and I'll say this right up front, tonight's file has that very particular kind of chill to it, because it doesn't begin in a cemetery or a ruined house or some lonely stretch of back road. It begins in a government archive. A clean, quiet, official place where documents go to sleep under numbers, stamps, and release dates, and little black marks where words used to be. And sitting in that archive is a title that sounds almost too dramatic to be real. The Adam and Eve Story by Chan Thomas. Not a horror novel, not a campfire tale, a book about cataclysms, pole shifts, erased civilizations, and the possibility that the human story has been reset before. The moment you see that declassified in part language attached to it, your brain does the thing it's not supposed to do. It starts asking, why? Why this book? Why this author? Why this theory? And why does something that reads like the end of the world have an intelligence agency stamp on the folder? Chan Thomas was not just some anonymous pamphlet writer muttering doom into the wind. The biographical material tied to versions of the text presents him as an engineer, a man trained in electrical engineering, a man who wanted to pull together geology, ancient myth, biblical language, forgotten cities, and the possibility of recurring disaster. That is where this gets strange, because he wasn't simply saying the world will end someday. Thomas was suggesting something colder than that. He was suggesting that it had already happened, more than once. In his view, the stories handed down to us, Noah, Adam and Eve, old flood legends, lost continents, vanished temple cultures, were not just symbolic memories. They were survivor reports, softened by time, dressed in myth, carried from generation to generation by people who no longer had the instruments to explain what their ancestors had witnessed. That idea turns every ancient story into a warning label, and every warning label into something that might have been written after the sky went wrong. Here's the heart of the nightmare. Thomas believed Earth suffers sudden violent shifts, the kind where the outside of the planet changes its relationship to the poles, and the oceans and atmosphere do not politely wait for civilization to adjust. Imagine the ground beneath you still being the ground, but the world it belongs to no longer lining up the way it did 5 minutes ago. Oceans surge out of their basins, winds become walls. Earthquakes don't just crack highways, they tear open continents. Cities are not slowly abandoned, they are swallowed, crushed, burned, or buried so completely that thousands of years later the descendants of survivors argue over whether they ever existed at all. Thomas's catastrophe was not a slow fade into ruin, it was a switch being thrown in the machinery of the planet, and every nation, every map, every border, every familiar coastline suddenly becoming a ghost. Now I'm going to pull something from the file here because this is one of those cases where the paper itself feels haunted. I've got a printed copy of the release title page, the one that carries the CIA document markings and the title, The Adam and Eve Story. It looks plain. That's almost the worst part. No dramatic warning label, no skull in the corner, just government formatting, release language, and Chan Thomas's name staring back like the top card in a deck you maybe should not have cut. A few pages in, the table of contents reads like the outline of a doomsday sermon. The next cataclysm, the great floods, the story, the event, Genesis, conclusion. And then you see the claim that lands like a cold hand on your shoulder, that catastrophes like Noah's and Adam and Eve's are not only ancient memories, but part of a cycle. The document doesn't need lighting around it. The silence around it does the work. And this is where the title becomes more than a title. The Adam and Eve story is not just using Genesis as decoration. Thomas reimagines those oldest names as clues. In that framework, Eden becomes a memory of a drowned or destroyed motherland. The serpent, the tree, the fruit, the expulsion, these are treated not only as spiritual symbols, but as encoded pieces of some older disaster, a message that survived by becoming religion. You can feel why this idea keeps crawling back out of the archive, because it says our oldest sacred stories may be the smoke trail of something physical. It says the human race may have been standing in the ruins so immense that the only way to preserve them was through myth. And if Adam and Eve were not the beginning but survivors after an ending, then the book is not about creation. It is about recovery from a world that had already died. The really unsettling part is how well the legend feeds on absence. A released document is one thing, a sanitized document is another. The mind sees missing pages and instantly starts filling them with monsters. People repeat claims about a larger manuscript, about hundreds of pages not visible in the common release, about the real version still being tucked away somewhere beyond public reach. Maybe that is why this case has so much power. The official record gives us just enough to prove the folder exists, just enough to show that Thomas's catastrophic vision passed through a government channel, and just enough empty space for the imagination to start clawing at the walls. Tonight's question is not simply whether Chan Thomas was right. The question is why this particular apocalypse came back to us wearing a government stamp, and what, if anything, was left in the dark. And that's the thing that keeps tugging at me. The missing space becomes part of the story, almost like the silence is trying to say something.
That is deeply unsettling. A book about the end of the world is creepy enough before the government starts trimming the edges.
And even if you're trying to stay calm about it, that sanitized label makes your mind wander. It's like the file is daring you to imagine the worst.
Exactly. Coming up in the second half, we'll look at the science, the myths, the missing page legend, and why this document keeps finding new life online. Juniper, I'll turn it back over to you and Chris.
The most unsettling part of the Adam and Eve story is not the apocalypse it describes, but the silence surrounding it. When a government archive leaves pages missing, the imagination begins filling in the blanks.
So far tonight, we've got a government archive, a catastrophic pole shift theory, ancient stories reimagined as survivor memories, and a book that seems to get stranger the longer you stare at it. And I have to wonder what everyone listening is thinking right now. Is this just an old fringe manuscript that got filed away somewhere? Or is there something about the missing pieces that still makes the room feel colder? Chris, I'm handing it over to you.
Thanks, June. I've got to say, this one has that perfect shadow frequency unease to it. A dusty old book is one thing, but a dusty old book with a CIA file number and sanitized pages, that's when the imagination starts chewing through the walls. And while you're chewing through those walls with us, do us a favor and like and subscribe on whatever platform you're using. It really does help the algorithms find the show and push it out to more strange little corners of the world. You can find the Shadow Frequency on Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, Rumble, and all the major podcast directories. And head over to shadowfrequencypodcast.com for every episode, the companion blog, merch, show notes, and links to every platform. You can also support the show by buying us a coffee on the website. And if you've got a story, theory, or creepy little thought of your own, reach out through the website by email or voice message. It might even end up on a future episode. June, I'll send it back to you.
Thanks, Chris. All right, it's time to warm up the spectral cosmic message materializer. I'm adjusting the dials, waking up the static, and giving the old machine a polite little warning not to bite anyone this week. Let's see what it has dragged in from the outer edge of the signal.
From the void.
A note that slipped through, still cold from the morning air. Let's unfold it carefully and see who's been listening in the dark. This one comes from Norris in Wisconsin, and he writes, I listen on CastBox most mornings while I'm out delivering newspapers. I'm usually rolling through quiet neighborhoods before sunrise, and there's something about hearing your show while the houses are still dark and the streets are empty that makes everything feel a little stranger. I'm a big fan of the conspiracy episodes and ancient mysteries, especially the ones where history feels like it might be hiding another story underneath it. Keep doing what you're doing because you make those early morning routes feel a lot less lonely and a lot more haunted. Keep the headlights steady and the shadows behind you, Norris from Wisconsin. Norris, I love that. There is something beautifully eerie about the shadow frequency riding along on a newspaper route before sunrise. That feels exactly like the kind of place where the signal should be heard. And thank you for listening on CastBox. We appreciate you spending those quiet morning miles with us. If you'd like to send us a note, a story, or something strange you've been carrying around, you can email us any kind at shadowpodcast@protonmail.com. And now I'll turn it back over to Chris for the Shadow News.
Cheers, June. Norris sounds like he has the perfect listening route for this show. Empty streets, porch lights, newspapers, and ancient mysteries before breakfast. That's basically a shadow frequency postcard. Scientists say climate change is now slowing Earth's rotation enough to measurably lengthen the day. New research shows that as polar ice and glaciers melt, that water spreads toward the equator, shifting the planet's mass and making it spin a little more slowly. The change is tiny, about 1.33 milliseconds per century right now, but researchers say the pace is unprecedented in the last 3.6 million years. June, I'll send it back to you.
Thanks, Chris. And isn't that strange timing for tonight's case? We're talking about pole shift panic and planetary catastrophe theories, and then the real science news comes along and reminds us that the Earth is changing in measurable ways, even if it's only by fractions of time. That does not mean Chan Thomas had the whole thing figured out, but it does make the planet feel a little less still beneath our feet. In the second half, Matt's going to take us deeper into the missing pages, the mythology, and the science pushback, and why the Adam and Eve story keeps crawling back into the conversation. Matt, bring us back in.
Chan Thomas claimed civilization had been erased for P4 and could be erased again in a matter of hours. Whether his theory was science, speculation, or something stranger, the warning still feels like a shadow hanging over the modern world.
Thanks, Juniper and Norris, delivering papers before sunrise in Wisconsin with this show rolling through CastBox. That is absolutely the right setting for this episode. You're half awake, the streets are empty, the porch lights are glowing, and somewhere in the back of your mind is a CIA-marked apocalypse manuscript. And Chris's shadow news fits almost too neatly tonight because we're talking about the planet's motion, mass shifting, time stretching, days lengthening by almost nothing, and yet still enough for scientists to measure. That is the unnerving part. Not that the modern research proves Thomas's catastrophe. It doesn't need to. What it does is remind us that Earth is not a fixed stage underneath us. It moves. It flexes. Its ice melts. Its oceans redistribute weight. Its magnetic field wanders. Its crust keeps old secrets. And sometimes the tiniest measurable change can feel like a key turning somewhere far below the floor. Now let's step deeper into why this book refuses to stay buried. The CIA angle gets the headlines, but the real engine of the story is the pattern Thomas thought we saw across human memory. Flood myths, fire myths, sunken lands, gods arriving after disaster, survivors starting over on mountaintops or islands or unfamiliar shores. Atlantis is the obvious one, but Thomas also pulled from the wider cabinet of ancient mysteries, pyramids, Easter Island, Baalbek, Tiahuanaco, and the idea that certain ruins might not be primitive beginnings but leftover fingerprints from people living after an earlier collapse. That is the seductive part of catastrophism. It takes scattered mysteries and ties a black thread between them. Why do so many cultures remember the water rising? Why do so many stories begin with a world before this world? Why do we keep finding monuments that seem too ambitious for the explanations we hand them? In Thomas's universe, those are not separate riddles. They are fragments of the same broken mirror. I'm pulling another item from the file now, and this one is less dramatic looking, but maybe more important. A printout of the released author page and supplementary reading list tied to the text. What grabs me is how broad the trail is. You see references that point toward lost cities, lost continents, ancient peoples, earth science, biblical history, and writers like Velikovsky and Churchward. Names that might live on that borderland between alternative history and forbidden library energy. That reading list tells you what kind of room Thomas was building in his mind. Not a narrow scientific paper, not a simple religious tract, a room full of maps, scripture, geology charts, vanished empires, and books with dust on the covers. And whether you accept his conclusion or not, you can almost picture him trying to make the pieces lock together, convinced that if he stared long enough, the ancient world would confess what happened before the last reset. Here is the one grounded check we have to put on the table. Magnetic pole reversals are real, and the magnetic field has reversed many times in Earth's history. But mainstream science does not support the idea that a magnetic reversal causes the crust to suddenly slide, the oceans to fly out of place, or civilization to end on a predictable cycle. Official science sources describe reversals as geologic events that happen over long spans. And USGS says there is no evidence tying magnetic reversals to mass extinctions. That matters. It means we should not pretend the released document proves the apocalypse. It does not. But here's the shadow frequency wrinkle. The lack of proof does not erase the cultural power of the thing, because the fear is not only what if Thomas was right, the fear is also what else has humanity misunderstood because we kept translating disaster into story. Sometimes a theory can be scientifically weak and still feel psychologically dangerous, because it points at something older than evidence, the memory of being small beneath a sky that can change. And maybe that's why the sanitized label matters so much. A normal old book can be ignored. A strange old book can be mocked. But a strange old book that passes through a government archive and comes back with release stamps, missing context, and public questions around it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a haunted object of the digital age. You don't have to hide it in a temple. You don't have to seal it behind a stone door. You just let part of it appear online with enough mystery attached and people will do the rest. They will compare editions. They will count pages. They will ask whether the missing material was boring, sensitive, embarrassing, or dangerous. And slowly the file becomes less like a book and more like a mirror held up to our deepest suspicion that somebody, somewhere, knows more about the end than they are saying. So maybe the mystery is less about whether the polls will suddenly flip tomorrow and more about why this particular warning keeps finding new believers. A fringe book becomes a CIA file. A CIA file becomes a Freedom of Information Act discovery. And that discovery becomes a PDF. A PDF becomes a thread, a video, a late-night conversation, a voice saying, "But why did they sanitize it?" And every time the story changes hands, it gains another layer. The black marks become darker. The missing pages become more important than the pages we actually have. That is how modern folklore works now. It doesn't need a campfire. It needs a document number, a government website, a blurry screenshot, and someone with insomnia willing to scroll too far. Maybe Chan Thomas found a hidden key to the ruins of the last world. Maybe he stitched together myth and geology into a beautiful nightmare. Or maybe the real sanitized apocalypse is what happens when an unfinished document leaves just enough blank space for us to imagine the end. And that may be the final chill here. Not that the world ends in the book, but that the book gets stronger every time a piece of it seems just out of reach.
That's what makes it linger. The mystery isn't only in what Thomas wrote, it's in what people think might still be missing.
And that is exactly the sort of thing that keeps the internet awake until 3 a.m. with 17 tabs open and one very worried cup of coffee.
Absolutely. The Adam and Eve story sits in that strange place between document and legend, archive and apocalypse. And maybe the scariest part is not that it predicts the end of the world, but that once the government stamped it, trimmed it, and released it, it gave the world permission to wonder what was left behind. Juniper, I'll turn it over to you.
The CIA file is real, the sanitized pages are real, and the unanswered questions are real. Sometimes a mystery becomes more frightening not because of what has been revealed, but because of what remains hidden.
Tonight on The Shadow Frequency, we stepped into the sanitized apocalypse, the strange story of Chan Thomas, the Adam and Eve story, pole shift panic, ancient catastrophe myths, and the haunting power of a partially released government file. We looked at the book, the legend, the missing page mystery, the eerie pull of ancient flood stories, and the grounded reminder that real science and apocalyptic folklore are not always the same thing, even when they brush against each other in the dark. Thank you for joining us for another strange case. You can follow The Shadow Frequency, of course, on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, Rumble, and wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget our website, shadowfrequencypodcast.com. And of course, come back next time because the next strange case is already waiting somewhere in the static. You guys want to say goodnight?
Good night, everybody. Thanks for spending part of your night with us. And remember, sometimes the strangest stories are not hidden in ruins, but filed away in plain sight.
Good night, folks. Keep asking questions. Keep an eye on the odd little details, and maybe don't read too many declassified apocalypse files right before bed.
Good night, everyone. I'm Juniper, and until next time, keep the signal close, keep the shadows listening, and be careful what you find when the black ink finally fades.
This episode was conjured with a solemn vow to explore the unexplained while remaining bound to the truths that have been unearthed. All interpretations are speculative and offered only for your enlightenment and your entertainment.